County Norristown Public Library, and today I'm going to talk to you about baking bread. We're going to bake some bread in a bag. Well, we're not baking it in a bag. We're going to mix it in the bag and bake it in the oven in a pan. So anyway, to talk about bread a little bit before we start, people get nervous when they think about making bread from scratch because they think it's hard, they think they're going to fail, and it's mostly because people don't understand what the ingredients do, why they're important. So we're going to talk about ingredients before we start. First, a loaf of bread only needs flour, water, yeast, and salt. Those are the main core ingredients to make bread. If you have those four things, you can make bread. So the most important part of baking bread is the yeast. Well, one of the most, they're all important, but yeast is pretty important because it makes the bread rise or get soft and fluffy. So what yeast is actually a little organism, and this organism feeds on the sugar that's in the dough. Now, I said the main ingredients are flour, water, yeast, and salt. I didn't say sugar, but when the flour and the water mix together, it starts to break down into starch, and starch becomes sugar, and that's what the yeast feeds on. So we have our yeast, and it's eating the sugar, and as it eats the sugar, it expels carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is a gas, so that puts little bubbles in your bread dough. And the little bubbles expand as the bread bakes and helps make a structure so that your bread doesn't go boom. That's what makes your bread nice and light. So we want the yeast to be happy. In order for the yeast to be happy, they have to be at the right temperature. And I think this is probably where a lot of people have trouble with bread, is they don't know the right temperature to keep their dough and to keep their water. So yeast are happiest between 70 and 90 degrees. So if you're trying to get bread to rise and you have it on a counter in your air-conditioned house, it's going to take longer to rise because the yeast is not so happy. So if you can find a place in your house where you can keep that 70 to 90 degree temperature, your yeast will be very happy and expel lots of carbon dioxide and make your bread nice and puffy. The other ingredient that's important is the flour. And the flour, when it mixes with water, makes a substance called gluten. You probably hear people talking about gluten a lot, gluten-free stuff all the time. But gluten for bread is very important because gluten is a protein that when you add water to it, it creates strands. And the strands are what gives structure or shape to your bread. So you want to have lots of nice, strong gluten strands in your bread to make a nice, solid loaf. So how that happens is as you mix the bread dough, you've seen people kneading dough, pushing it around with their hands, and that as the dough mixes and as you knead it, it makes the gluten strand stronger. So the longer you can knead your dough, the stronger your gluten strands are, the better your structure is for your bread. So that's another thing you need to remember when you are making bread dough. Make sure you mix it long enough to form those strong gluten strands. There are different kinds of flour. The flour we're using today is just general all-purpose baking flour that you get at the grocery store. There is a bread flour that you can buy that has more protein in it that makes a little stronger, chewier loaf of bread. And a lot of people like to use that for your bread, but regular all-purpose flour would be fine. You can also use whole wheat flour. The thing with whole wheat flour is it has that germ of the wheat in it, not like disease germs. This is what they call the outer coating of the wheat kernel, and they grind that up into the flour. So It's much healthier for you than white flour because it has vitamins in it. But it also adds a little bit of the germ is kind of sharp. You can't see it with your eye, but if you look microscopically, the bits of germ are kind of sharp and they kind of cut into the gluten strands. So you have to be mindful of that. If you use whole wheat flour in bread, you might want to add a little bit more yeast just to ensure that it rises. You also would need to add a little bit more water maybe than your recipe calls for, because it also absorbs more water. The wheat germ in the whole wheat flour absorbs more water than white flour. So keeping those things in mind, if you ever want to experiment with this recipe in the future, just know those things. So we're going to go on to the ingredients for this recipe. Now before you start, let's prepare our work surface by using some hot water and dish soap and dish cloth and wash down at all the surfaces that you're going to be using. You will need a free space. You're going to be kneading the dough a little bit, so you will need a free flat space to be able to do that, either on a counter or a table. So make sure that's nice and clean with your hot soapy water. You also want to wash your hands. You want to avoid touching your face. If you need to itch your nose or any other part of your body, use the back of your hand or the back of your arm. Sneeze or cough into your elbow. Coronavirus rules, basically, to keep yourself clean from any germs that might get into your food. Tie your hair back if it hangs in your face. Get rid of any dangly jewelry or clothing that could get stuck in your food or get in your way. And now I think we're ready to start. Okay, so here's our flour, and we're going to add some sugar, a little bit, to get the yeast started, so it doesn't take so long to get going. We have yeast, and I was actually fortunate to get a whole pound of it from BJ's, so I'm well set for yeast for a while. A lot of people are having trouble finding yeast. We need some oil. I have olive oil here, but any kind of oil. We don't need a lot of it. That just helps make the dough a little bit softer. We got some salt, and then we're going to add some water. So if you got a packet from the library, you will already have your first ingredients mixed together: the flour, the sugar, the yeast, and the yeast in one bag, and then the second part of the flour in another bag. So if you're following along with the packet from the library, you're going to start with that first packet that has the flour, yeast, and sugar in it. The other things you're going to need if you're making this from home and you didn't get a packet from the library, you will need a bowl. You will need a spoon, tablespoon, a teaspoon, half teaspoon, and a quarter teaspoon, and you will need a 1 cup measure, and everybody is going to need a loaf pan if you have it. If you don't have it, you can use a baking pan and make like a round or oblong kind of a hearth loaf. Don't necessarily need a bread pan, and something to grease the pan with, whether it's spray oil, regular oil, shortening, or butter. You just need something to keep the dough from sticking inside the pan. And if you did not get a packet from the library, you will also need a zipper closing plastic bag, a storage or freezer bag, in the gallon size. So the first thing we're going to do is measure our flour, and this recipe calls for 3 cups of flour divided. That means that some of the flour is going to be used for part of the recipe and the rest of it's going to be used for another part of the recipe. If you've got a packet from the library with the ingredients, these are already measured out for you, but I'm going to walk through it just in case you didn't get a packet or you want to try this recipe again at home and need the steps to do it. So First thing you do, you're going to fluff up the flour with a spoon so that it's not too packed together. You don't want packed together flour because then you're actually putting too much flour in your recipe, and that makes what you're baking dry. So I'm going to just level this off. You can use a knife, you can use the flat part of a spatula. I have this this scraper that is good for leveling things off and scraping things up. And now you're going to take your bag and you are going to put that 1 cup of flour inside your bag, like so. Now I'm going to measure out the other 2 cups of flour that we need, and I'm going to put it in this bowl so that we have it handy for later. So we're going to do this again, fluff it up. Don't pack it down, just plop it in there. Level off the top. You always want to fill your cup all the way to the top and level it off. So there we go. Put it in the bowl. Do one more. Fluffy, fluffy flour. Okay. Level. Oops, level it off. And dump it in the bowl. Okay. So now we're done with the flour. We can get that out of the way. Then we need the sugar. And we need 3 tablespoons of sugar. And that's also going into the bag. So there's 1, and 2, and 3. Okay. Sugar, flour, and now we need the yeast. And it calls for a package of rapid rise yeast. My yeast is instant dry yeast. Instant or rapid rise, it's all the same thing. It calls for 1 packet, and sometimes you get yeast in a little string of 3 packages all stuck together, and they're pre-measured. If you have something like this where you have to measure it out, sometimes I get it in a jar for bread machines, and 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast equals 1 of those packets. So I'm going to measure out 2. Whoops. This is awkward the way this is set up here, but whatever. Okay, there's 1. And I'm not too terribly worried about getting the measurements exact for yeast because a little more yeast is not going to hurt. It's actually going to make things go faster. So now there's another kind of yeast that you can, there are other kinds of yeast that you can get. There's our 1/4 teaspoon. So that's 2 1/4 teaspoon in there. The other kinds of yeast you can get, there's just the active dry yeast, and that generally, first of all, you need to mix that with water to activate it, and secondly, it usually takes a little more time for things to rise if you use that. The instant dry yeast is manufactured so that it doesn't take so long. You don't have to soak it in water before you mix it into your dough. This recipe is telling us to mix it with water beforehand. This is called making a sponge, and what it does is it just gets the yeast moistened and gets things started a little bit. But if you're using active dry yeast, most of the time you can just, the instant dry yeast, I'm sorry. If you're using instant yeast, you can just mix everything up right away. But we're going to follow the recipe because that's what we do until we know what we're doing, and then we can play around. So now we need a cup of water. And the temperature of the water is important too, because we need to have between 100 and 110 degrees for the yeast to get started working properly. So how you figure out when it's warm enough it needs to be a little bit warmer than your body. So your body normal temperature is 98.6. So if it's a couple of degrees warmer than the inside of your wrist, I use the inside of my wrist because that's the most sensitive part of my hand. And that's still a little too warm. That should do it. Okay, so we need a cup of water. And that should be the right temperature. Now we're going to dump the water into our bag of stuff. Dump it in there. Close the bag up. Make sure it's tight all the way across. And you want to squeeze out as much air as you can, because if you don't, it's going to be like a balloon and pop. So there, we've got pretty much all of the air squeeze out. And we're just going to massage that around, mix that up, and make sure everything is all mixed up. Get that yeast all nice and toasty and wet and exhaling those carbon dioxide things, bubbles in there. Get it nice and happy. It's going to love all that sugar we threw in there. Okay, so make sure, just keep scrunching it around until it looks like, oh, there's still a little yeast right there that's stuck to the side. See how that's kind of balloony up there? You want to make sure there's not so much air that it pops open. Okay, looks like we got it pretty much. Now we're going to let this sit for 10 minutes and just let that yeast get nice and happy in there. While we're waiting, I'm going to measure out the salt that we need. We need 1.5 teaspoons of salt. So I'm going to put 1. And salt is what gives the bread flavor. And salt also kind of keeps the yeast in check so it doesn't go crazy. Yeast doesn't really like salt that much, so when the salt gets added, it kind of stalls things and slows it down a little bit. And that might be another way that bread stops working the way it's supposed to, is if the amount of salt is off. Some people might be tempted to keep the salt out or not put in as much, but it does serve a purpose other than flavoring the bread. It does help the yeast not be so crazy. The other thing you can do while you're waiting is prepare your pan. If you have spray oil like this, you can use that to grease your pan. If you don't have that, you can use shortening or butter or lard, or even your oil if you use a clean hand, and spread it all over the inside of the pan so that your bread comes out when it's baked. It won't stick to the pan. So I'm going to spray this. Make sure all my sides are covered. Some people like to put a piece of parchment paper or a piece of foil cut to fit inside with the edges hanging over each side so that they can just pull the bread out when it's finished and not have to worry about trying to shake it out of the pan. But usually with bread, usually the outside bakes hard enough that it doesn't really stick fast that much to make it hard to get out of the pan. And like I said, if you don't have a bread pan like the one I just showed you, you can use a cookie sheet, a baking pan like this. Just oil the bottom, and I will show you later how to form it into a free-form loaf that you can bake on this pan like this. Okay, our 10 minutes are up, and you can see the little bubbles are starting to appear here. The little yeasties are happy and bubbling up. So now what we want to do is we want to put in a cup of the flour. So we're going to add a cup of the flour that we just measured out. And I'm not going to make it exact. At this point, everything's all measured out and ready to go. So it won't hurt if it's not exact this time. And then we need 3 tablespoons of oil. Okay, so I have olive oil here. You can use canola oil, sunflower oil, coconut oil melted, even butter if you don't have any of that, or lard melted. You just need, this is just going to make the bread softer. 2 and 3. And the salt. Watch out, yeasties, here comes the salt. And then we're going to close it up again, just like we did before. Make sure it's locked all the way across. And we're going to get almost to the edge. Squeeze out all the air you can. And then finish locking it up. And make sure it's good and sealed. And then you're going to squish this around again like you did before, so it's all nice and mixed up. And see, it's getting a little gooier in there. Pretty soon it's going to be more doughy. And it's starting to pull away from the bag a little bit, if you can see. And that's a good thing, because we want it to be a nice gathered together dough when we're all done. Okay, that looks like it's pretty mixed up pretty well. So now we're going to put our last cup of flour in there. Just dump the bowl in. I would reserve a little bit, maybe like that much, to put down on your surface. If you don't have flour in your house, if you do, then you can just use flour. But if you don't, if you're relying on the package that I gave you for your flour, keep some back so that we can put it on our surface when we go to knead the dough after we get it all mixed up in here. So now, yeah, it's getting much stiffer. And those gluten strands formed in there, so we have a nice solid loaf, not a wimpy one. We don't want wimpy bread. We want bread that we can spread butter or peanut butter or jelly on. Okay. Just switching it around. Well, it seems to be holding together pretty well. Might be a little bit sticky in there. We're just going to see how it's pulling away from the bag. We want that to happen. We want it to eventually get to a workable mass so we can knead it. Okay. So that looks pretty good. Okay, so my camera flaked out on me through the whole process of dumping out the flour onto the surface and getting the dough out of the bag, and my observation that it was a little bit sticky. And so anyway, it's sticky. Part of the reason it's sticky is because it's humid today. There's moisture in the air because it's raining outside today. So that might have a difference in how wet your dough is. It's still a little sticky there. I put some extra flour on the surface. If you have some, by all means use it. I will try to make sure there is extra flour in the packets when you receive them so that this is not a problem for you. So if your dough is sticky, just add a little bit more flour, kind of spread it around so that Now you can see, you can stick your hands in there and, well, it's a little bit still, but not so bad. Okay, so now we're going to knead this dough, and the kneading is just mixing all the ingredients together so that it becomes a smooth dough. We're developing the gluten so we have a good structure for our bread when it's baked. We want to make sure those gluten strands are nice and strong and long. And we're going to get that yeast all mixed up all the way inside the dough. So the recipe says to knead this for 5 to 10 minutes. That's a long time to do anything, to do the same thing for a while. But what I would suggest is you find 3 songs on your playlist. The average song is about 3 minutes long. So put your 3 songs on and knead to the music. And when your 3 songs are over, your dough should be nice and kneaded and mixed well. So how we do kneading, you start with your dough all nice and flat. And then you're going to kind of press the heels of your hands, this part, the heels of your hands. You didn't know your hands had heels, did you? And you're going to grab the edge and you're going to fold it toward you and kind of press it down. Now you're going to give it a quarter turn. Turn it this way. You're going to press your heels in, pull it over, turn it, press, fold, turn, press, fold, turn, press. And it's getting a little sticky, so I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of flour on top. Press, fold, turn, press. And once you get the hang of it, make sure your stuff isn't sticking to the table. If it does, just sprinkle a little. You don't want to overwhelm your dough. You don't want to get it too dry. You just want to make sure it's nice and soft and elastic as you continue to knead. I have an attachment. I have a very nice mixer, and I have an attachment on my mixer that actually can knead the dough. So I kind of cheat that way. So if you have a mixer that has a little kind of corkscrewy looking attachment, that is your dough hook, and that can, you can just stick your dough in there and turn that on and it will knead your dough. But this is kind of a calming thing that you can work out all your frustrations and anger in your dough. If you have any little brother or sister that's bothering you, or can't play with your friends, or you can't go to the park, or can't see your grandma, whatever. You just kind of work that in. It is so sticky in my house right now because of the rain. I can just feel it in the dough. But you want to get it so it's nice and kind of smooth, not sticky, doesn't stick to your hands when you push your hands into it. And just keep going, play your songs, do the thing. I'll see you back here in about 10 minutes. Okay, our 10 minutes are up, and if you've been successful, you've got this lovely, silky, smooth, smushy piece of dough. Now here's a trick I learned in cooking school to help you know if your bread dough is ready. You take off a little piece, kind of flatten it between your fingers. I can't get a good picture here. Flatten it between your fingers, pull it, until it's thin. And if you hold it up to the light, you can see through it. It's called, it's a window, a dough window, a test window. And if you can pull it so it's very thin and it holds together, this one's falling apart a little bit, but mostly together, and you can pull it very thin and see through it, and it doesn't break apart, then you know your dough is well kneaded. Okay, so now we have this, and we need to shape it into a loaf. Now, if you don't have a loaf pan, you can just sort of shape it into whatever shape you like to put it on the baking sheet, like there. You might want to make it a little longer and thinner, so you have more like an Italian loaf of bread. Or you can make it round and just sort of shape it until it's the shape you like. You can have a round loaf. And make sure that you greased your baking pan and put this right in the middle, because what's going to happen next is we are going to let it raise and get bigger. So if you have a bread pan, you can just sort of make a log. Bread pan. That you want to make sure it's long enough to fit across. Make sure the top is nice and smooth, because any dents you put in it now are going to stay in there and be part of your shape. If you don't like one side, you can flop it over. And just keep pulling it and shaping it and rounding it until it's as long as your pan. Pop it in there. Can't tell where this, and just let it lay in there. Now we're going to cover it up with a towel and put it in a warm space. Now what I like to do is put it inside my unheated oven. If you turn on the light, if you have a light bulb inside your oven, you can turn on the light and keep it in there. And actually that light bulb warms up that small space and makes it like a perfect 80-90 degree kind of proofing oven for your bread. So you want it to raise. You want to let it go till it raises up, just about maybe doubled in size. You want it to kind of round out across the top of the pan. So you're going to let it in there for about half an hour. If you have a especially warm place in your house that's between 70 and 90 degrees, you can put it there. We just need to get a clean towel to put over top. And just going to do that. I have my light on inside my oven, and I'm putting this in here, and everything's safe because the heating element is not on, so nothing will bake yet. It'll just stay nice and toasty warm inside here until the bread rises to the right point. So put it in there for about 30 minutes, check it. We'll come back and see what it looks like. Okay, this is what our loaf looks like after 30 minutes or so. You can see that it's nicely rounded. It filled out the pan. It looks pretty good. I'm gonna just touch it a little bit. The dent sort of sprung back a little bit, so I'm gonna leave it in. You don't want to be poking your fingers in it too much, but a gentle touch that doesn't spring back means that your dough is ready. So I'm going to put it in for another maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll see what it looks like. Okay, I'm going to say our loaf is pretty much ready to bake. So we're going to cover it back up for now because we have to heat the oven. And while we're heating the oven, it can continue to rise a little bit. So we're going to bake it at 375 degrees. And when that's heated, we'll stick it in the oven. Okay, oven is ready. And in goes the bread into the oven. And then we bake it for 25 to 30 minutes. So I'm going to put it on the lowest amount of time, 25 minutes. And then we're going to check it and see if it is ready to come out. Okay, it's been 25 minutes. I'm going to check out this bad boy here. It looks really nice and brown. If you happen to have a food thermometer in your house, you can check the internal temperature. It is supposed to be somewhere between 190 and 200 degrees in the center if it's completely baked, which is saying 195, so I think we're good here. But you can also get it out of the oven and do this because the wire rack is causing me problems. But, sorry. Sort of has a little bit of a hollow sound when you tap on it. And just, you can see it's very nicely browned and looks pretty good. Now what I like to do after I bake the bread, if I can get it, pick it up here and get it over to my rack, I like to take a little bit of butter and smear it on the bread while it's hot. And you can get if you have a pastry brush, you can brush it too and just sort of spread it around there, and that makes the outer crust soft on top. You don't need to do this. I like to do it because I like to have a soft upper crust on my bread. And plus it adds a little bit of extra flavor, because who doesn't like bread with butter? Butter bread. Okay. Okay, so we're going to let that sit and cool for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to take it out of the pan. Okay, now I'm going to turn it out of the pan, because you should have a rack. Ooh, look how nice and brown that is underneath. Flip it over so it doesn't get stripes from the rack in there. It's hard to do with one hand. Okay, now we're going to just let that, keep your hands off of it. We're going to let that cool, and I know it's really, really hard to let it cool because there's nothing better than a slice of freshly baked warm bread. But believe me, you'll thank me by if you let it cool all the way before you cut it, because the gluten structures are still establishing in there. They're still kind of soft and mushy from being hot. So we want to let them cool completely so the structure is strong and your bread can hold all the peanut butter that you slather on there, or nut butter or jelly or whatever you put on your bread. But just let it sit, walk away, just walk away from the bread, and come back in maybe 20 minutes or so, and we'll give it a slice and see what it looks like inside. Okay, now for the test. Let's see what it looks like inside. Oh, look at that. Oh, we got a little hole. That's okay. We can eat around the hole. And look at that crumb. Look at that. It's nice texture. Not too dense. Got enough air holes in there from the little yeasties. And don't worry, they're no longer active, so you don't have to worry about them being alive in there. They died. I'm sorry. So here we go. I'm going to taste a little piece here. Oh yeah. This is really good. I'm going to get me some butter and some jelly. And I hope yours turned out as good as mine. And you will enjoy this.